The groan of protesting metal was the sound of a tomb opening for the first time in 10,000 years. The colossal blast doors, separating the world of the known from a forgotten age of horrors, slid apart with agonizing slowness, unveiling a maw of absolute blackness. The wave of air that washed over them was not merely cold, it was a physical presence, a fetid exhalation from a long-dead lung. It carried an organic, cloying sweetness of decay layered over the sharp tang of unknown chemicals, a scent that spoke of flesh twisted into unnatural forms. And then there was the sound. A wet, skittering chitter, a noise made by 1,000 tiny, needle-sharp legs scrabbling over metal. It grew louder, a rising tide of clicks and scratches that promised a frantic, mindless hunger. Kalen raised the sunreaver, his knuckles white on the grip, his stance wide and ready. For a heartbeat, he forgot the weapon was dead, its internal fire sacrificed to the pedestal. The realization crashed down on him, cold and heavy as a burial shroud. He let out a low curse, dropping the inert metal crossbow to hang from its sling and drawing his family's broadsword. The ruined blade came free with a grating shriek, its jagged, melted edge a testament to their last victory and a poor omen for the next. "By the light!" Alara breathed, her voice a fragile thing in the sudden vastness. The crystal of her staff flared, its pure white light lancing into the gaping doorway. The light did not find a single monster. It found a flood. They poured from the darkness like maggots from a corpse, a living carpet of chitin and limbs. Each creature was the size of a large hound, a nightmare fusion of insect and machine. Their bodies were segmented, beetle-black carapaces glistening with foul slime, propelled by 6 scythe-like legs, 4 of jagged chitin, 2 of mismatched, whirring metal that scrabbled for purchase on the floor. Their heads were a cluster of twitching antennae and multifaceted eyes that glittered with a malevolent, ruby-red light, their mandibles dripping a viscous, acidic saliva that sizzled where it dripped. "A forge of life, you said?" Kalen yelled over the rising cacophony, his voice tight with grim irony. "Looks more like a bloody charnel house." The lexicon's terminology was uncontrolled biological synthesis, Alara retorted, her face pale but her eyes blazing with focused energy. "A fine distinction, I'm sure." The first wave hit the edge of her staff's light, and did not slow. They were a tide of hunger, a swarm given singular, ravenous purpose. Kalen swung his broken sword like a club, the heavy steel connecting with the lead creature with a sickening crunch. Chitin shattered, and green-black ichor sprayed across his greaves, but 2 more surged to take its place. "Fall back!" he roared, planting his feet. "Find a choke point!" But Alara stood her ground. Her lips moved, shaping words of power that were sharp and cold as the heart of a winter storm. She thrust her staff forward, and a wave of shimmering, absolute cold rolled from its crystal head. It was not a blast, but an instantaneous flash freeze. The air itself seemed to crystallize. The first 20 feet of the oncoming swarm were caught in it. Their frantic chittering was cut short as they were frozen solid in mid-stride, transformed into a grotesque sculpture of frosted horror. The momentum of the swarm behind them shattered the frozen creatures into a million glittering, razor-sharp shards. The reprieve was momentary. The tide flowed over the remains of its vanguard, undeterred. Kalen smashed another crawler, then another, the impacts jarring his arm to the shoulder. He felt a sharp, burning pain in his calf and looked down to see one of the creatures clamped onto his leg, its mandibles trying to chew through his leather boots. He swore and stomped down hard with his other foot, crushing its head with a wet crack. Beside him, Alara was a whirlwind of frantic creation. "Ignis Murum!" she incanted, sweeping her staff in a horizontal arc. A wall of shimmering, orange flame erupted between them and the doorway, incinerating the front ranks of the swarm. The stench of burning chitin and cooked alien flesh was nauseating, but it bought them precious seconds. As they scrambled back, stumbling over loose plating, Alara did something strange. She raised the hand wearing the new ring, the one with the tiny red crystal, and pointed it at the seething mass of creatures trying to flank the firewall. The tiny red dot, the one they had dismissed as useless, danced across the floor. The effect was bizarre. A dozen of the crawlers suddenly broke from the pack, their red eyes fixated on the tiny point of light. They abandoned their assault, scrabbling over one another to chase the dot, batting at it with their metallic forelimbs like monstrous, feral cats. "What are you doing?" Kaylin shouted, bewildered. "Distracting them," she cried, her voice strained. "Their optical sensors must be attuned to this frequency of light. It's better than nothing." It was just enough. The momentary confusion in the swarm's ranks gave them the space they needed. As they retreated, Kaylin finally got a proper look past the wall of fire and into the chamber beyond. It was a cathedral of blasphemy. Vast, cylindrical vats of that same unbreakable green glass, some shattered, some intact, lined the walls of a cavernous chamber that stretched further than Alara's light could reach. They were filled with a murky, amniotic fluid in which floated the half-formed shapes of things that should not be, limbs ending in too many joints, torsos with weeping eye sockets where a heart should be, coiled masses of tentacles and teeth. Great, articulated metal arms, like the limbs of some skeletal god, hung from the ceiling, tipped with an array of cruel instruments, gleaming scalpels, buzzing bone saws, and clusters of long, delicate needles. The floor was a slick, treacherous morass of organic sludge, discarded carapaces, and pools of stagnant, chemical-laced water. This was the bioforge. This was where the ancients had played at being gods, and had apparently created only devils. The wall of fire guttered and died. The swarm, their path clear, surged after them once more. "This way!" Kaylin bellowed, spotting a narrower service corridor they had passed on their way in. It was a dark, cramped opening, barely wide enough for two men to walk abreast. A perfect choke point. They reached it just as the lead crawlers snapped at their heels. Kaylin spun around, using his bulk to shield Alara as she slipped inside. He kicked a large, twisted sheet of metal part of the golem's scavenged armor and managed to wedge it partially across the opening, creating a crude barricade. The crawlers slammed into it, clawing and biting at the metal, their shrieks echoing horribly in the confined space. Kaylin braced his shoulder against the opposite wall, panting, his lungs burning. Alara leaned against the cool metal beside him, her knuckles white where she gripped her staff. They were splattered with gore and slime. Alara looked down at a smear of green ichor on the sleeve of her pristine robe with an expression of profound disgust. "We are overwhelmed," she stated, the scholar in her assessing the tactical reality even as the elf recoiled from the filth. "My reserves are not infinite. We cannot fight a legion." Kaylin's mind raced. His Sunreaver was a useless weight. His sword was a bludgeon. They had 2 healing cylinders left. They had no way forward, and the path back was blocked by an army of abominations they had unleashed. His eyes fell on the swarm clawing at their makeshift barricade. They ignored the metal, the stone, the inanimate objects of the hangar. They were drawn to Kaylin and Alara with a singular, terrifying focus. They were hunting life. Then, a new sound cut through the din. A deeper, guttural chittering from the back of the hangar. A larger shadow detached itself from the gloom of the bioforge's entrance. It was a crawler, but one that dwarfed the others, its carapace thicker, its metallic limbs more heavily armed, ending in whirring saws and pincer claws. An alpha. It moved with a terrifying deliberation, directing the lesser creatures with a series of sharp clicks. Their position was no longer defensible. It was a trap. Kaylin's gaze fell to the pouch at his belt. The healing cylinders. The crawlers were organic. The cylinders contained, what? A potent healing unguent, a restorative agent. A concentration of biological stimulants. An overwhelming lure. It was a desperate, insane gamble. "Alara," he said, his voice low and urgent. He pulled one of the white cylinders from his pouch. "Get ready to run." Back the way we came. Don't stop for anything. On my mark. She saw the look in his eye, the cylinder in his hand, and her own eyes widened in understanding. She nodded, her expression grim, and tightened her grip on her staff. Kalen twisted the base of the cylinder. With a soft hiss, it unsealed. A rich, sweet, medicinal scent, far more potent than he expected, filled the small space. He drew his arm back, took a deep breath, and with all his strength, hurled the cylinder in a high arc across the hangar, aiming for the furthest, darkest corner, away from their escape route. The effect was instantaneous. Every single crawler, from the ones clawing at their barricade to the hulking Alpha directing the assault, stopped dead. 1,000 ruby-red eyes swiveled in unison, tracking the soaring cylinder. The moment it clattered against the far wall, the swarm broke. It was a complete, instinctual override of their previous objective. They abandoned the barricade, the hunt, everything, and became a single, surging river of chitin and steel, stampeding across the vast chamber towards the potent organic scent. The Alpha let out a furious roar of a screech and charged after them, plowing through its own kind in its haste. Now! Kalen roared. He kicked the barricade aside and they burst from the corridor. They ran, armor clanking, robes flying, sprinting through the suddenly empty space. They didn't dare look back at the feeding frenzy that had erupted in the far corner, the sounds of snapping mandibles and rending metal echoing in the cavernous hangar. They fled past the silent, monolithic containers, past the wreckage of the Sentinel Golem, its own long war now a mere footnote to the greater horror they had released. They reached the heavy door leading out of the hangar, and Kalen threw his weight against it, slamming it shut. The thunderous boom of its closing was followed by the heavy, final thump of a locking bar falling into place. Silence, save for their own ragged gasps for air. The chittering of the Carrion tide was muffled, a distant, terrifying promise on the other side of the thick metal. Kalen slumped against the door, his entire body trembling with adrenaline and exhaustion. Elara stood a few feet away, her chest heaving, her face a mask of grime and horror. She looked at the viscous slime on her sleeve as if it were a living serpent. "We should have left that door sealed," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Kalen pushed himself off the door. He looked down at his own filth-splattered armor, then at the last remaining healing cylinder in his pouch, a newfound understanding dawning in his eyes. "No," he said, his voice quiet but hard as forged iron. "We just found out how to fight them." He met her gaze, his own eyes burning with a grim resolve. "Now we just have to figure out how to kill them all."